Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this is the podcast for you. Welcome back, legends, to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. We are driving into town. We've got to go resupply. We've nearly run out of fuel, down to the flashing red light. Need more ice and just need to recharge the batteries a little bit. It's been a big sort of week and a bit since we've last spoken to you guys. It's currently the 22nd of September. We've filled a few more tags, been amongst the elk again, mule deer, and starting to certainly feel the effects of 20 odd days of hunting now. Sit back and relax. We've got a little bit of a drive ahead of us, so we're just going to recap all our highs and lows from the last sort of 10 days of hunting. Cayuga Broadheads. Where do I begin? Ayden and I have just absolutely taken to and love these broadheads. He's shooting the 150 grain Zots while I'm shooting the 150 grain pilot cuts with bleeders. There was no other head that I was going to run in Montana on my limited entry hunt than the pilot cut. And I was so happy when I took down the bull of a lifetime. We've teamed up with Cayuga to get 10% off your next order by using the code TWIN10 at checkout. That is TWIN 10 the number at checkout to get 10% off your next order.
So as you would have heard after last podcast where we sort of talked about my nemesis, which were the antelope, we've focused pretty solely on James trying to fill his tag on a nice bull elk. And to be honest, we weren't really sure if there was another good mature animal around after I'd taken that bull on the second day of elk and deer opening. And we were pretty happy to realise quite quickly where we'd actually left and sort of been checking every so often on these little group of cows that we had tucked away in a little hidden draw. Obviously being on public land, we were just checking back and forth, making sure that they were still there, and where they were was a nice little draw. There was a little bit of access to feed nearby in the form of agriculture, and they seemed quite content. And much to our surprise, after not hunting there for a little while, I think it might have been 2 or 3 days later, James had the bow, and we were very much indeed looking for elk. And this particular morning, we basically got to this area, we're ready to start hunting, and just as we got out of the car, probably a mile away or so, we hear a bugle. And I'll let James go into that, but it was amazing what we laid eyes on very shortly thereafter.
So we crested over a hill and immediately could see, a pretty significant herd of cows and satellites below us, and one really magnificent bull just going absolutely crazy. Even in the low light conditions, we could see that he was definitely a shooter and definitely a new bull that had moved in on this herd of cows. And so got the spotting scope out, and got a little bit of footage, mag view footage there. Ayden got a bit of footage, and we, with the wind not really being too strong at that time, I decided instead of going immediately in on this pretty good group, it was probably 25 animals, maybe 20 cows, a couple of bulls. I opted to let them, go and bed down, and we were just going to sit there and watch them and then move in. So it was pretty anticlimactic in the sense of, you've got this big bugling bull in front of you, and, a lot of people would have rushed in there, but just with the thermals going against the prevailing wind direction, and being so many eyes, not a lot of cover, I thought, we know where they're going to bed up. They're just going to go into that little draw. They've been living there for, probably 10 days now or so. Let's try and do the smarter, more sensible option. And in hindsight, I don't know if it was, but it's the decision that we made. And so we sat on the hill, and watched them go back into this little draw from sort of 6 o'clock when it first light hits, and lost all the elk by just say 7:30, no noise, nothing. And then we sat there until the wind really started picking up at about 11:30. And so we've done this massive, because they dropped into the draw, I wasn't sure exactly where they'd gone to bed. I'm assuming they'd be like at the top of the head of the gully, but there was nothing to say that they hadn't walked down, a couple of 100 meters and bedded in another thicket of timber. So what I ended up doing was making the decision to go and do a pretty hefty loop of probably maybe a K and a half, a mile, whatever unit of measurement you want to use, and get in on the draw that they were in, and start moving up it slowly. And so we're moving up glassing, and the wind's perfect. It's coming straight down towards us. I'm not worried about the thermals at this stage, dropping into the draw and something potentially get our scent. And just to describe that to you, like, it's very much open prairies outside the draw, and then inside the draw it's you've got all these sage in the bottoms with sort of grass mixed in certain points, and then it goes into sort of thicker timber and sort of thickets of like brush. And we were moving up. We started off about a K and a half from where, moving up the draw. We'd gone through a couple of bits of timber and they weren't in there. Not that we weren't surprised, but just that we wanted to make sure. And I just looked at Onyx, and we were 750 yards from where I'd put a pin in the timber that I thought these elk were. And there was this little patch of, like, this little thicket of timber that I'd glassed a couple of times, and couldn't see anything in there. And just as we were moving up, 2 mule deer, a doe and a fawn, pushed out of there and went running up the gully. And I didn't think much of it, to be honest, at the time. But about 5 seconds later, here come 20 elk running out of the, where they'd been bedded, exactly where my pin was essentially. And they're standing now on like the high side of the prairie, or the high side of the hill, I guess, like looking around like startled. And these mule deer must have run straight up the creek bottom and run like through these bedded elk. Like, I'm not talking like around them or anything. I'm like, they must have been through them, bedded in the valley floor, because like for these elk to act how they did, they pretty much ran up there, stood there for probably a minute or so looking around, and then elk being elk just started putting miles between them and this potential threat. And so we pretty much lost that bull. We had, like, after that, for the rest of the day, like, it was pretty deflating to try and think that you had like everything perfect. I was like super convinced we were going to have this like awesome encounter. Whether I was going to actually get the bull on the ground or not, I wasn't sure, but I was like, okay, we're going to at least get in close and have a really good opportunity here. And for that to happen at 750 yards, it was fairly deflating, to be honest, and really frustrating, just because I felt like I'd done everything perfect and just had this complete red herring outlier just ruin everything. We thought they might just move up the gully a little bit, but no, they'd pretty much gone out over the head of the gully, and as we learned, they'd moved probably about 4 miles, so 6 kilometers away overnight, which just goes to show, elk being elk, what they're very good at. Like, they move across this landscape very quickly and very easily, being such large animals, and so whenever they do feel that little bit of pressure, the first thing they do is move. But he was a fantastic bull, and so our time and effort was then going to be invested into re-finding this bull, especially knowing how few elk were in the area, and also the potential for actually like a trophy bull. So that was the first encounter with this magnificent beast.
So what made this bull so, I guess, recognisable and just different in comparison to a lot of the other younger bulls that we'd been seeing and sort of passing up is he had this massive buff head on him, and he was a nice 6x6, very much a typical 6x6 in terms of antlers, but he definitely had, what he lacked in probably length, he definitely made up for in width. But his fronts up to his G4s were really, really long. All of them, could have been even 20 inches in length. Like, it'll be interesting to see if we can ultimately get him on the ground and take, some measurements up close and personal. But just as a bit of a guess, like, they're very exceptional. And then where he sort of, I guess, has a few flaws, as some of these animals do as they get more mature and start potentially even going back, is the back end. So his 5th and 6th tines look like they've almost like shrunken a little bit, or he didn't have quite the resources or energy to put into those last few tines. And he's got the mass, the weight, the width, all these type of things, and then very good fronts. We're assuming that maybe he's an older bull past his prime going backwards, and the way that he's been strutting around with the satellites and younger bulls and throwing his weight around sort of certainly suggests that as well. But because he was so identifiable in terms of antler length and just maturity, we ended up finding this bull again the next morning, and what we'd done was obviously go back to a very similar position to where we last saw them, and then we just kept jumping from ridge to ridge, high vantage point, and basically leapfrogging, looking for any signs of elk. And we didn't really see anything for the first hour or two of daylight. And as you'll see, this is just going to be a very short, surmised sort of version of events, just because we want to obviously talk to a little bit here. But for all of this stuff, you'll be able to watch it on future episodes of YouTube channel, on the Twin Elements YouTube channel. But we basically were ready to move off, and I remember just casting my eye basically literally as far as I could see out, and it was probably, as James said, probably 4 or so miles away. And I just was looking at this water source, and it was actually on private property that we can't hunt, but I was just looking at it because I was like, oh, that's weird, I've never sort of seen cattle in that paddock. And I remember just seeing and looking, and as soon as I raised the binoculars to my eye, I was like, holy crap, there's 30 to 40 elk just sitting at this water trough, probably an hour or two after daylight. And I said to James, I'm like, there's a decent bull in there. I can't even see tines or anything like that, but every time it turns its head or chases another bull, which I was assuming were the animals on the sort of periphery of this mob, you could just tell that it had pretty decent antlers. I said, shit, it's worth a look. And again, we've sort of prefaced there that it was on private property, so we weren't able to actually hunt them at that time. But what we did over the next, I don't know how many hours, was close a gap from, miles away to probably about 700 meters, I'd say, maybe up to a mile. And what we did was very quickly realize that this was in fact the same mob and bull that we'd put up the day before when those mule deer ran through. And it was stinking hot. It was easily probably, I don't know, I'd say 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which probably translates to high 20s, if not 30 degrees Celsius. But the thing out here is that when the wind dies down and there's no shade, it just gets so hot, dry, and the conditions can be really harsh. And we ended up watching this bull for all day. We were just waiting, hoping that they were going to feed back towards us through some ag onto public land. And it's funny how things turn out, because what went from being one of the hottest days that we've had an experience here, where we were dehydrated, we didn't pack enough food, we missed lunch, we didn't have enough water, we were just sitting there in the boiling sun watching these elk in the off chance that they would turn around and come, it was only a matter of probably 200 meters from where they were over a boundary fence onto public land. But the weather had other things in mind and things in store for us, and it literally then went from boiling hot to freezing cold and torrential rain. There was lightning, thunder, almost like thunderclaps that was so loud. And basically we had to pack all the camera gear away in a haste, chuck them in dry bags, sit there for about 20 to 30 minutes watching these elk. And unfortunately, rather than coming back towards us, they unfortunately, with all the rain and thunder and adverse weather events, got up and they basically trucked it, a couple of miles away over a few ridges and further onto that private. So we ultimately did a mad dash to the car. Again, one of the things about hunting sort of this country is that it's so dry, but when it does rain with all these heavy clays and different soils, it gets super, super boggy, and not wanting to, get bogged for one or damage these public roads, we elected to sort of drive out and go back to camp and sort of lick our wounds a little bit, because it was pretty demoralizing sitting there with so much hope that, we've got eyes on this really good bull. He's only a couple hundred meters over the fence. Hopefully he comes back for the afternoon, and then to have all that switch and then get further and further onto private, it sort of made us think are we going to actually get another opportunity? And with that, we actually were like, nah, tomorrow we need to shift things around a bit, and we're going to move on to trying to fill one of these deer tags. And I think the change was definitely good for us because, as you'll come to hear, I think the elk sort of had our number for a little bit, and then moving to mule deer just meant that we could obviously, target a different species. Hunt and Fool is the foremost hunting resource with varied levels of memberships to get you on your next adventure. Whether it be an annual trip or once-in-a-lifetime adventure, Hunt and Fool and the consultancy team will cater to your needs. James and I have been utilising their services for a couple of years now, and virtually immediately, James reaped the rewards when he drew a coveted limited entry elk tag. James would not have known about the opportunity, let alone ever applied for this unit, and therefore, without the assistance of our friends at Hunt and Fool, a hunt like this would not have been achievable. If you're interested in using Hunting Fool's license application services to draw more tags across the Western United States, then please email applications@huntandfool.com and mention Twin Elements to get 25% off your first year of service. The Hunt and Fool team will take care of it from there.
So taking the bow out again, we went to an area where I'd stalked a pretty good muley buck earlier in the trip, and we were up on a high vantage point at first light and actually saw 3 really good bucks, like mature bucks, going sort of over a draw into a next little gully system. And the thing about where we're hunting them is there's so much of this, like these deep guts or gullies, and it's so easy, like, because they just go through one and over the next and slip out there, and then they go up a side chute, and all of a sudden they've done a couple of left rights and you're anywhere near these animals anymore. And it's happened a couple of times before, and so we've seen these 3 bucks go over a ridge, and I said to Ayden, we need to cover the ground pretty quickly. And so we've run down this first ridge and started, closing the gap. And we actually watched them go over the next ridge, probably at about, instead of being a mile out, we're probably 700 now. So we've sort of halved the distance. And we watched them go into this next one, and I was pretty confident that we'd be able to find them. But we ended up spending about 5 hours trying to find these 3 bucks, and long story short, could not turn them up anywhere. Found plenty of does, found a couple of forkies, and I was just in a mood where I still had an elk tag and a deer tag at this point, and Ayden still had a deer tag, and we were just about to have a whole group of people come in that we're going to potentially be doing some bird hunting with and coyote hunting with, and I knew available hunting time was sort of getting less. And so I just had this mood where I was like, I want to go and fill this deer tag, essentially. Like, if I can fill this deer tag, in my mind, it gives me, we had this big bull that I wanted to put some time into finding. Ayden obviously wanted to put some time into finding a big mule deer. So I was like, well, let's try and find a decent muley buck. And we're just walking down, glassing in to all these pockets in the shade, and Ayden actually spotted 2 bucks, a little forky and a 4x4 fighting on a ridge. And sorry about that. Thing about a live podcast is that we just passed some other hunters heading in on this public road, so a bit of competition is always good. Hopefully they can get onto some animals. Yeah, so we pretty much watched it. We just had, similar to the day before, we just had a heap of rain, so these animals were up on their feet and sort of, sparring, which was awesome to see. They were mucking around, and we watched these 2 bucks run into some deep draws, and we ended up watching the bigger of the 2 that I said to Ayden, like, I would go and shoot that buck. Like, I would well and truly, like, knowing that he wasn't the biggest buck in the world, but saying I would be more than happy, I'd be stoked to go and shoot that buck. And he ended up, bedding down in a fairly identifiable and open bed. And so pretty quickly we dropped down and went around, did a big loop to try and get in above them. And we put Ayden in a little perch so he could film the whole event, and I continued my loop around to come in above this buck. And the wind today, on that day, was just absolutely perfect. Like, it was probably blowing a constant 15 to 20 knots. Which just meant that I didn't really have to worry about it too much in my mind, which comparatively to my previous stalk where I had no wind was like a really nice change. And I'd put an on-X pin, taken a heap of videos of the landscape, just learning from my previous stalk. And so as I moved in there, I took my shoes off and started identifying all these landmarks. And the biggest thing with this buck was he was sort of half in a cave and over like a pretty steep sort of drop off, and I knew that like I couldn't shoot him from I thought I couldn't shoot him from above directly straight down, because it's only like a 2 meter drop and he's going to pretty much hear me come in. So I'm like, okay, I've got to sort of try, and then he was bedded right up against this sort of bank, I guess, which left a very small shooting window. And what ended up happening is I ended up sneaking in there and found this buck bedded at like 30 meters. I could just see, like, came over a little bit of a rise and I could see him. But the way he was sort of lying, I didn't really have much of a sort of shot opportunity. And I was right on the edge of a cliff. Like, if I could have just taken 2 steps to my right, it would have been fine. And so because he was in the sun and it'd taken us an hour to get to this point, I was like, okay, he's in the sun, he's puffing pretty hard, I can see it. He's only 30 meters away. I'm like, he should get up sooner or later. And so I ended up just standing there ready, trying to skyline myself as least as possible, and stood there for about 20 minutes. And in that time, the breeze sort of shifted, felt like it was sort of dropping down and shifting a little bit, which made me a little bit nervous. I'm like, I might have to make something happen here. And I looked forwards, and probably about 1.5 meters forwards, there was a little chute of the cliff that I went out on that sort of extended out maybe only 2 feet, just say. But I just thought, if I can move forward that 1.5 meters and then go out on this edge, it might just give me the angle that I need to be able to sort of slip this arrow just over his sort of hip, because he was pretty much better sort of quartering arse on, if that makes, like, pretty tight arse on where I was currently. So I'm like, I just need to open up that shooting angle a little bit and get a bit higher and forward so I can, get it into where it needs to. And the wind picked up really strong, and I just went step by step, slowly shuffling my feet. I didn't want to break eye contact with him. He was pretty consistently had his head down, whereas he'd been throwing it around a lot beforehand, which sort of was making me nervous to actually start moving. And I just slowly started shifting my feet and ended up getting out on that ledge. And as soon as I was there, I was like, okay, perfect. I knew that I was about 28 meters, pretty much picked the spot like right over the top of his hip and just drew back. And because it was so windy, it was actually quite difficult getting steady, but I just sort of told myself, like, take your time, and just ended up, to be honest, just absolutely threading the needle. Like, it sort of came in at the back of his back strap, like right about 5 inches up from his back strap, and got full penetration all the way through and popped out right at his brisket. And he was dead on his feet. Like, the amount of blood instantly in the bed was like super impressive. And I mean, that's what, like, pilot cuts with bleeders are just absolutely devastational. Like, the wound channels that you get with them, like, in my opinion, are second to none. And so, yeah, this buck pretty much got up, ran about 20 yards, and then that was it. Just collapsed there and died. And he was, like I said, it was more of just trying to fill the tag, but also a buck that I was super, super stoked to actually get on the ground. Like, he was my first mule deer, and I'd had a tag a few times now in Montana, but always just like prioritizing elk over mule deer. And I guess in this sense I am a little bit as well, still prioritizing elk over mule deer. But to be able to fill a tag and get my first muley was a massive relief. And yeah, we obviously butchered him up, got all the meat, had a couple of mile walk out. But yeah, it was just so cool to actually get my hands on one of them. Like, their hair is so interesting, their massive ears, like their ears are bigger than your hand, and like full of all these like tiny fine hairs that I can only imagine like potentially help with their hearing. But yeah, they're just beautiful animals, like so just perfectly adapted for this sort of arid environment. And they just blend in so incredibly well. But yeah, I was, so happy and so thankful to be able to get such a beautiful buck on the ground. And like I said, just relieved now that we had a little bit more time, that I could focus in on this big elk, and Ayden could focus in on finding another mature muley buck to fill his tags.
So as you would have heard, it was nice to finally have a little bit of success because, as James alluded to, the last couple of days following on from that have been nothing but pretty difficult, to be honest. And as you'll hear here in a second, the next morning we got up and we elected to go and return and look for that big bull, hoping that because they weren't spooked by us on the last time we'd seen them, but the fact that they were definitely on private, we were hoping that with a day in between, that rain, there was no scent on the ground, that they would wander back onto the public. And we basically woke up that morning and walked into a complete whiteout. And what I mean by that was it was cool temperatures, but we basically had a huge blanket of fog and we couldn't see anything until about 9:30, 10. On this particular morning, it was a little bit wispy, so every minute or two you might get 10 seconds of viewing time, and we identified that there were in fact elk out on the fields and out on the ag, making their way back in. But where it was difficult is that we couldn't actually properly work out where they were, in the sense of you'd see elk for about 5 seconds and then a minute or two later when you could look there again, they were gone. And we kind of repeated this process over a couple of hours, eventually realising that, hey, the morning's got away from us, it's now lunchtime. I don't even think we made a play on these elk purely because we had no references to where they were. And I think the wind from memory was quite bad this day, going the complete opposite direction to normal and blowing our scent from where we were over the field. So we sort of elected, I believe, to actually back out and go and do some bird hunting that day.
There's a reason they say, get serious, get Hoyt. Ayden and I have always shot Hoyts, and that's because we're rough on gear. Our bows are constantly getting knocked and thrown around, but we know they will stand up to the test when the time comes. Hoyt has created the lightest, best performing carbon bows on the market. While some people change their bows like the season, I've had my old girl since 2019 and she's still performing flawlessly. If you're in the market for a new bow, get serious, get Hoyt. I think the biggest thing too was the fact that we could see all these elk, but and we could see that there was bulls with certain mobs, but they were so, because of our optics not really being able to work in the fog, it was so hard to actually identify if it was our bull or if it was just another bull, because we could identify and see that they were bigger animals than a cow and had antlers, but you couldn't see distinguishing factors. And also the fact that we were a couple of miles away from these different herds, and they ended up just dropping into all these different draws. And like Ayden said, the wind was really, really poor and crappy, and so we're just like, nah, we're not going to pressure them. It's it's reassuring knowing that they've come back onto the public, so let's not pressure them at a half chance, and let's come back tomorrow. Well, little did we know what we just experienced in fog is super rare, but apparently talking to the ranchers now, 2 days of fog, which is what we had, is something that hasn't happened in the last 60 years. And so we woke up this second morning, and honestly, I'm not going to lie, there was a thought in my head that just said, go back to bed, after the first day. And we probably should have, in hindsight, because we ended up just sitting. We couldn't, the day before, it was a bit wispy and you could actually look out and see a little bit. The second day, it was full whiteout until about 11 o'clock, and then all of a sudden, in a blink of an eye, it was gone. But we couldn't see anything. And so obviously before, most of the time these elk are moving off, the sun's up at 6, they're gone by sort of 7:38. So yeah, to have the day almost start at 11 o'clock was a little bit disappointing and felt like a bit of a waste of a day. And anyway, I was a bit frustrated because obviously wanting Ayden to have some hunting time as well. And I was like, okay, well, if this is going to be my hunting day, then let's actually make the most of it. The wind was still pretty poor, so we ended up driving around to get that better, and doing a huge couple mile loop. And we spent the better half of a day walking a massive draw system that we'd seen these elk go and bed in previously. And we did not see a single elk. It was a bit demoralizing, to be honest, in the heat of the day, getting absolutely cooked. And yeah, to not find a single elk, not even a spike or anything like that. And then we got back to the car, which was sort of the middle point. We were about to go set up on a high point in glass. And as we got back to the car, where we had some dehydrated meals and some water and we we're going to cook it up, a couple of coyotes actually let out some yapping in front of us at probably 500 to 600 yards. And instead, we pretty much walked straight past the car. And at that point, it's like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We'd both run out of water. We'd had like a couple of muesli bars and some sardines for the day. So we're fairly cooked. We were looking forward to that, more food and water. But obviously when opportunity on coyotes presents itself, you take it. And so we ran down there trying to get to these coyotes, and they ended up just pretty much disappearing on us by the time that we'd got there. And it sort of had this decision where it's like, okay, we're now sort of like, because we kept looking for them. So we're now sort of a kilometre, maybe a little bit more from the car in the direction that we wanted to go. It's, you know, sort of 4:30, it's getting dark, it's sort of 7:30. It's like, okay, well, do we spend a little bit of time walking back to have lunch, get some water, or do we just keep walking? And ultimately, a decision was made to just keep walking in the direction we're going, which ended up being, I guess, in our favour, but meant that we spent a couple of days fairly cooking ourselves with minimal food, minimal water, and just being out all day in the hot baking wind and sun. And the wind had turned pretty crappy, was blowing every direction, and we're making our way to this glassing knob that we wanted to sit on. And funny enough, I like looked up and I'm like, what the hell are they? There must be antelope just bedded like in the open. And like these elk have just got this characteristic where they just love bedding in the open. And I looked up on our glassing knob where we wanted to be sitting to look into these drawers that I thought the elk were going to come out of. And here's 8 satellites and this herd bull and a heap of cows just bedded on this knob. And I was like, shit. So because the wind was pretty average, we ended up doing a massive loop once again, like a couple of miles around to get the wind right. And they'd spread out and started feeding sort of below us in some pretty open like prairie country, not a lot of, couple of sage bushes as cover. So really it was just topography. And I could see that the bull and a couple of cows were sort of splitting off and going one direction. And so Ayden and I sort of moved around and crested the ridge, and my plan was to get as close as I could to the cows and sort of let out this bugle. And long story short, I essentially shit the bed because my mouth was so dry from not being able to drink water now for like 5 or 6 hours. And then like on this day, I think we ended up doing something like, I think it was over 25 or 24 Ks or something like that for the day. So we were probably at kilometre 20 just say, and we'd run out of water for 5 hours. And this bull's like 120 metres below me on this cow, and there's a couple of cows that are probably at like 80, and I've gone to rip a bugle and it's gone like, because I just had nothing in my mouth. And yeah, then did like a cow call. Everything's like up on its feet now, looking like, what the hell is that? What just died up on the ridge? And that was my confidence and self-esteem. But I, went to rip another bugle, and same thing happened. Just like could not get like contact. And they sort of like, what the hell? And they just sort of moved back to the main mob. And then we had like, I think I ended up counting, there was like 40 odd animals out there in a pretty open area. I had like no cover and about an hour of light left, and just made the decision that, okay, well, look, we know where these elk are now. They're obviously hanging back on the public. You've had your shot for tonight. Come back tomorrow. Hopefully the wind's going to be a bit more consistent and we can do it all again, hopefully get it done. But it was, once again, just a little bit of a deflating ego situation, having, you know, this beautiful, incredible, massive bull and all these cows in front of you, and just essentially not being able to perform under pressure. So yeah, it was good to see him, but you know, with every opportunity, I feel like we're educating him a little bit too, which makes everything significantly harder each time. But as you'll hear shortly, it was not the last time we were going to get in on him. But we might wrap it up here for now, as we are just about to get to town, and we will talk to you guys shortly.
We honestly have been here so long that the hair on my head has grown that much that I've had to extend the cap, the little clip on the back of my cap, if that makes sense. And again, we've been here that long that I think we've had 1 shower per 10 days, I think, something about those odds. So yeah, we've certainly starting to stink, starting to get tired. I've even had to notch my belt 1 buckle closer, so lost a little bit of weight in the last few days of not eating much and not drinking much and all that type of stuff. So we're definitely starting to feel the effects of hunting these elk and deer and everything. But as James said, we've got probably another week to 10 days left here in Montana as it stands. And James has his elk tag, I have my deer tag, and I'm certainly keen to hopefully lay eyes on a mature buck. That's probably my biggest thing. Again, I feel like my trip's already been made, in all honesty, by shooting that bull elk early on, and then having so much fun with the pronghorn, which I didn't actually anticipate would be, sort of high on that list now for me as an animal that I'm already looking forward to hunting again. And to be honest, maybe because I haven't actually seen a mule deer buck up close, it's like of any maturity. But I imagine that if we can actually locate one and get in a bit closer for a look, that things might change for me.
Bringing target precision to hunting camp, Option Archery makes specialist gear. Their quiverizer is one of our favourite bits of kit. This stabiliser combined arrow quiver is extremely unique, cutting weight with its clever 2-in-1 design. The Option sights are versatile in this regard also, offering both a single or multi-pin sight housing within the same sight. Shop their products today.
So, continuing on, we're back in the car, going back out to camp. And after the 2 days of fog, we were pretty inspired to try and have another encounter, a bit more of a close encounter with this really big bull. So we got up on the ridge early and sitting glassing, and it was a beautiful sight being able to see more than 100 yards. And so we had all this ag and everything laid out in front of us. And straight away, we were able to identify this quite prominent herd of elk. There was probably about 40 elk or so in this herd. And from first light, we just kept track of them, watched them move into and across a couple of draws, and ultimately the herd sort of split up, and about 15 animals went one way, and it seemed like, which was mainly the satellite spikers and a few cows, and then the main herd bull that we were chasing, as well as majority of the cows, probably 25 cows or more, went into this little thick timbered gully. And as we mentioned previously, as the wind was blowing a fairly ordinary direction, and so we ended up having to do about a 4-mile loop, which took us the better half of about 2 hours to drop down from where we sort of glass and watch these animals go into this bedding area and come all the way around to get the wind right. And as we were moving in, we actually saw the sort of split off group, and they were in a spot that we were fairly concerned that they would sort of get our wind, I guess. But there was nothing that we could do about that, and they ended up eventually catching our wind and running past this bedded group, and thankfully they were down in a draw. We were pretty nervous they were going to see them, the bull and the main cow herd, see all the satellites and everything running off, but luckily they didn't, and they passed them within 300 yards and just continued on. And so Ayden and I started traveling into where we'd last seen this group of cows, and it was sort of maybe 300 meters of this fairly high banked draw, that sort of very thick timber. And we're glassing, and not really seeing much, to be honest. It was quite thick, and I was hoping where they were going to be bedded was going to be closer to us, given the time of day and where the shade were.
One thing that James isn't really mentioning, or probably giving enough credit to as well here, is that from seeing these bulls and these cows and things drop into a draw at 3 miles, what you can't see is like 100 different draws between you and that exact spot. So when he says, we are now at where the cows went into, it's all based off assumptions and based off Onyx, and we're using Onyx mapping systems to basically look at it, try and measure with the rangefinder how far away they are. If that doesn't work, then we're then using different topography, landmarks, the highest point, different ridges, all this type of stuff to then try and locate spot X, which is where we think the cows have gone. So it's something that we've got heaps better at. We're getting better each time we do it every single day, because we're just using it with like bedded mule deer, antelope on a certain ridge, now elk, for example. But that just hopefully gives you a bit better context as to like going, okay, how do you know where the elk went after 4 miles? And it's, again, because we're in such open country, paying attention to each one of these little folds makes such a big difference, as you'll hear, because when you get to spot X and you're not seeing them, when you actually do get there and you're like, oh, these animals are massive, they're nearly the size of a horse, how are we not seeing them? You're nearly inclined to want to push to the next draw, but by going, no, this is where they should be, you have to slow down and sort of keep hunting properly and do the right things.
Yeah, so as we approach this draw, at this stage, at the very head of the draw, which is where I thought they would be, it sort of split into a Y, and so we're coming in on the left Y, glassing. But to be honest, I thought most of the animals, given the time of day and the sun, like I said, would be in the right side of this Y, and so I was still giving it the due diligence that I thought it deserved. You know, glass, take a couple of steps, glass, take a couple of steps. And to be honest, once I was about 25 meters off this draw, I was convinced that I could see into it well enough that if there was anything bedded in there that I would be able to see it, because a bit of the bank was sort of washed away. And I was a little bit hasty, to be honest, and instead of taking about 2 steps like I'd previously done, and then glass, take 2 steps, glass, I probably took 3 or 4. And in the end, I was looking towards where the 2 branches of the Y met, and in the left branch, I ended up seeing like half of a cow's head and just her ear focus. Like I'd sort of taken that half step too much. And so I sort of put my hand out for Ayden to stop, and she was only 25 yards away. She stared at me for probably about a minute or so, and then as soon as she stood up, then it was like, okay, now I'm like silhouetted at 25 meters and pretty much out in the open. As soon as she stood up, about 4 other cows, and I think maybe a spiker around her, also stood up, and there was almost this like false floor, like there was this bench, and then it sort of dropped away and had like an undercut bank area, which provided them this little escape, I guess, an area of shade, and obviously couldn't see into there, and didn't expect it to exist. And so those cows have sort of gone running back over to the right branch of the Y, where the rest of the herd then sort of became active. The bull started bugling and they started moving around and stuff. But it was enough that like the 4 cows that got up with the one was a sort of not immature, but younger cow, I believe, just from like the look of her face and the body size and everything. So I think that certainly helped my cause. And it sort of just alerted them, like a lot of the mature cows started looking around and whatnot, but it certainly didn't like blow them out of there, which is like an interesting contrast to the fact that the day before, a couple of days before, I should say, sorry, those mule deer, running through them had scared them and they'd moved miles, whereas now seeing, what they don't realize to be a human hunter at 25 yards was not enough to scare them out of there. But I definitely was very lucky on this day, and they didn't go running out of there. And what we ended up doing was we ended up like using the topography and sort of kneeling down and moving forward to the edge of the sort of cut in or bank. And I had cows at 60 meters bedded, and the bull was just around, and that was in where the 2 branches of the Y met. And I was a bit scared to drop down just with the wind like sucking down the valley. And so we opted to do a couple of cow calls to try and potentially make the bull think that there was a couple of cows still left over there and maybe pull him sort of my way. But what ended up happening was one of the I don't know whether it was the lead cow or one of the older cows, Ayden spotted her and goes, oh, there's an elk there. And in the middle of the Y, where it was sort of raised up a little bit, she came and was standing in the thick timber and stuff, and she popped up, and I sort of thought she'd moved back off a bit. We were just doing cow calls like intermittently, maybe 1 or 2, and then wait a minute, 1 or 2. And I thought she'd sort of moved off. And after about 5 or 10 minutes, we hadn't called for a little while. And I've dropped the cow call. Like I slowly moved my hand up to like my belly button and dropped the cow call into my hand and then popped it into my bino harness. And just that movement, like she must have been sort of looking for movement or looking out our way. And just that movement was enough to like blow her out. And she's gone running down there and all the cows have gone running out. And they end up, sort of going out of this cover onto the prairie and sort of standing about 100 meters away and taking stock, regroup, and then they started moving off into the next draw. And I just sort of said to Ayden, you go back and get the boots in the pack. I'll try and keep tabs of them. And so I watched them go. I watched them move across the prairie into this next draw, and just to see the last cow and one spiker go into the draw. And as they went in, they sort of started moving left. And I looked on Onyx, and this is like one of the benefits. And there was quite a big dam, probably 40 meters by 40 meters across, in the gully that they just dropped into, and about 350 meters sort of to our left. And I'm like, it's the middle of the day by now. It's like 12 o'clock. And I'm like, I bet you that's where they were going. And we ended up running back, chucking the boots on, chuck the pack on, and double backing and coming in above this dam. And as we got there, straight away we can see some cows on the edge of the water. And okay, this is perfect. And we're sort of above looking down onto it, and we can see the bull is like up to his neck, essentially like in the water. All the cows are just like fully swimming around. Essentially it looks like a party down there. And there's some cows bedded around the edge already. It's been probably 15 minutes. I'm like, okay, this is a pretty good opportunity. And as they started like moving out of the water, I sort of got down and started like moving in. There was a couple of cows bedded on the bank that I thought would have prevented me to move in earlier. But as soon as they sort of moved off and weren't staring our direction, I quickly started moving in and was able to cover the gap pretty quickly, as I had a bit of a gully between us and then them. They were up on the high side now. And they ended up moving out onto the prairie, and they must have been like, with this really strong breeze and just having a swim, like they must have felt cool enough that even in the direct heat of the sun, with no shade, to just start bedding up. And they ended up bedding up first at like 100 meters, and I was in a pretty good spot. And all of a sudden the bull started pushing all these cows back to me, and he ended up pushing them back to like 70 meters. And I'm thinking, here I am, like I've got this perfect shooting window, like the closest cow's at 70, and they're like walking towards me, and I'm like, okay, this is about to happen. And they pretty much just re-bedded again at 70. And we ended up sitting there for, how long do you reckon? 45 minutes?
Yeah, I was going to say half an hour.
So half an hour, 45 minutes, and they ended up, pretty much after a while, just got up and sort of moved off again. And I don't know, it's one of these things that we were pretty much living amongst this herd for this whole day yesterday, and it just, like I thought it was going to happen. We're pretty fatigued, both mentally and physically, but we were well and truly like on the heels of this guy and his herd. And we followed them off, and they went into the next draw again. And I looked on Onyx, and there was 2 draws that at that exact moment met and then went into a Y. And so we dropped down and sort of came up the right-hand Y again. And it was pretty funny because as we dropped down and came around the corner, there was a bull. Firstly, on the plateau above, there was a bull that was bedded, not a bad bull, but not a huge bull either, like probably like a pretty good red stag size satellite. And he'd bedded there, which made us we're like, okay, well, we can't follow the herd directly, so we're gonna have to go around. And we've gone to go around, we've dropped into the gully, and we're sort of running around, and we're like, all of a sudden Ayden's like, oh, what's that? Can you hear that? And we're like, oh, okay. And then all of a sudden at like 15 meters away, we just see all these spikes, and there's 3 spikers bedded in the in this like thick berry bush essentially. And I was like, well, these are like directly in the path of like where we need to go. So I'm like, we need to scare these things out. And so I'm looking for like a stick or a rock to like throw in there to try and get these things up. couldn't find anything, so pretty much ended up like getting in there and like chasing these spikers out. And then as they're running off, and then they like stop to look back when they were probably like 80 yards or so away. And I'm like, if these things barked with this herd being so close and already sort of fairly anxious, I guess, I'm like, nah, that like could be the end. So here I am chasing these 3 spikers like down this draw to just try and get them like into a different solar system. And ended up pushing them like fair way down, but thankfully they didn't bark. Which was perfect, and was able to double back and sort of go into where we thought the herd had bedded. And we're glassing, like really taking our time, picking apart after being a bit, disappointed in myself for putting the cow up the first time. And all of a sudden I turned to Ayden, I'm like, did you hear that bugle? And he's like, no. And I'm like, that sounded like it's like in the next gully system. So we pretty quickly doubled back. I put a pin where I thought the bull was just from looking at Onyx, and then worked through that first initial bedding area pretty quickly, and unsurprisingly didn't turn up the herd of cows and the bull. So we pretty quickly went back, grabbed the packs again, put the boots back on, and started following this herd down into the next drainage. And we're moving, we're trying to get in front of them to intercept them. And as we've like come around the top of this ridge, we look into the draw, and here's these cows, like probably 10 cows, starting to like move and feed across in front of us. And we're like, shit. So then we've had to like backtrack and run around, and then we're like moving in on them. And it's just one of these things that like, it's so crazy how fast these elk like move, even when they're just feeding and walking and stuff. Like they really do cover some distance. And we're sort of keeping track of the herd by every so often the bull bugles. And they're in this like pretty deep draw, but the draw keeps branching and stuff. So we're having to like follow and make sure they're not going down certain branches and stuff. And he'd bugle again, and we'd follow him up. And we ended up realizing that they'd gone and gotten into this sort of main draw system. Okay, perfect. So they're walking down there, and Ayden and I have done this big loop around to get in on top of them. And so they're in the main draw, and they're going to pop out, and they're going to have to walk across this about 300 meters of opening to get to the ag that they've been feeding on. And so Ayden and I'm like, okay, this is going to work perfectly. We're going to be above them and between the ag. And lo and behold, about 1.5 miles from where I'd first scared these spikers, these 3 spikers pop up on the bank about 150 meters in front of us, and like right where this bull is bugling. And we're like, you little bastards. And we sit there for ages, and the bull's bugling, and the spikers are piss farting around on the high bank while the whole herd, like the rest of all these cows, are below them. We made the decision not to scare them. I made the decision not to scare them, I guess, and Ayden was sitting there with the camera. So he, and these spikers eventually slowly started feeding off. And another complicating factor was about 300 meters down the bank further, we had about 100 head of cattle feeding. And so we've got these 3 spikers and this whole herd of cattle now. We've got these bull bugling below with about a 200 meter head start, and we need to beat them before they come out into the open, because if they come out into the open, then the game's over. There's going to be 30 cows and a bull in the open, and we're not going to be able to do anything. And so as the spikers start moving off, we're moving in, and lo and behold, we end up scaring the spikers, and that was fine. Like that was perfectly fine. But as we got to where we sort of wanted to be, we're about 100 meters away, and right where we wanted to be, the first cow like popped out, her head above the high bank, and started moving and coming out onto this open. And we were left essentially with no decision but to lie down. We just sat there and watched this herd of elk come out in front of us, and eventually slowly move across, and they bedded up a little bit again, and then moved out onto the ag. But really, with nothing but a couple of once again sage bushes in front of us, there was sort of nothing that we could really do. And so that was, we'd spent that was sort of the shortened version, I guess, and trying to make it as quick as possible for you guys. But we'd pretty much, that was by this time, this was about 6:30, 7 o'clock at night. We'd first seen them at 6 o'clock in the morning. had pretty much been on them since 11:30. So, you know, you're talking about a solid 7 or 8 hours being from 70 meters to sort of a couple of 100 meters for most of the day, just on this herd. And yeah, it was, I don't know, just, it was good. Like, it was good to actually feel like we had sort of a proper crack at him. I'm not going to lie, there was a few stuff ups, like moving too quickly, dropping that diaphragm out of my mouth. What else? Yeah, there was a few little stuff ups that I was pretty disappointed in myself with, but I think it was just an accumulation of, like, we're in camp with a couple of other people at the moment, so we've been going to bed at sort of 11 o'clock at night and getting up at 4:30, eating, like, you know, breakfast and then like 2 muesli bars and some sardines, and going out all day, not really, like, not having lunches, and then you know, eating a massive dinner, like not drinking enough water. You know, it's just, yeah, a recipe for disaster, really. And I think just a bit of brain fog there, probably just exhaustion, really, mentally and physically, and just ultimately led to some stupid decisions. But yeah, it was good to actually feel like we'd sort of had a proper stalk on him, I guess. Like, the first couple of attempts had ended pretty dismally, and yeah, it was good to feel like we actually had a proper day trying to get this big bull. It's been good playing cat and mouse with this bull, especially knowing that bulls of this caliber exist on public land, and there is opportunities for people to, you know, come from Australia or anywhere around the world, or even in the US, and be able to just rock up and hunt. So yeah, it's been a fantastic experience, and hopefully we can find this big fella again.
No FAQs from our end today. We will get back to you guys once we're in civilization, make sure we're answering all your questions and all that type of stuff. Hope you guys have all been enjoying James's Instagram posts on his James Doumtsis Outdoors page on Instagram. Make sure you're following us on Twin Elements on Instagram and YouTube, as we're going to be releasing a heap of content when we're back in about 2 weeks to Australia. It's been an amazing journey thus far, and something tells me it's only just heating up as we try and make every last drop of this Montana experience one to remember.